everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. Back in April, at the very early stages of this channel, I made 3 bookshelf tours. I own about 2,600 books, so capturing that in one video would take forever. So I did a tour of all the literature I've read, of my complete TBR, and one of my fantasy, science fiction and thrillers collection. Those videos are not very good. They're wobbly and the sound quality is very bad. Therefore, I had this plan of remaking all 3 of these bookshelf tours. One of them, my literature, I published in the second week of October. These bookshelves contain roughly 1,650 books. Perhaps 5% of them I have not read. As I was working on the remake of my TBR bookshelf tour, I suddenly realized something. Since I started reading fantasy again, my interest for literary or non-fiction books has waned dramatically. This means, first, that my section of literature that I've read will probably not change anymore. And second, in all honesty, I have to admit that there is very little chance that I'll ever read all of those books on my literary TBR. So instead of remaking the old video, where I also include my fantasy and thrillers, I'll do something different. This video is about drastically shortening my TBR for literature. By nature, I'm almost insanely naive about what is realistically possible in terms of the available reading time and all the books I so eagerly want to read. But going through the bookshelves, there was no getting around it any longer. My TBR for literature consisted of 171 books. My first elimination round was very difficult, and every decision I made was a tough one. It's sort of saying goodbye to a book that I had been wanting to read for so long. Like I'm discarding something valuable, a friend. Which I do in a way. Every book of the 23 that I took out this first round of the bookcase hurt. What made it all the more difficult was when I started leafing through this or that book. You shouldn't do that when you want to shorten your TBR. That only reminded me of how I really still wanted to read it. But I couldn't call taking 23 out of the 171 a drastic elimination. So, my second round, I decided to be brutally honest to myself, which resulted in another 37 books that I removed. The remaining 111 books, or the authors that wrote them, are too dear to me. The 60 books that I removed will find their way back to other bookcases. To physically get rid of them is one step too far for me. Even though I haven't read them, although in some cases I did start reading them, I have fond memories of the promise they held and still hold for me. Let me show you the bookshelves before the elimination process. For each shelf, I'll highlight some of the books that I could not possibly remove from my TBR. After that, I'll show you the 60 books that will no longer be part of my active TBR for literature. On the left we have Ernest Hemingway. He's an author I've been anticipating to read for years now. I started reading his novel, A Farewell to Arms, and I believe I started reading that almost a year ago now. Still haven't finished it. I'm going to finish it sooner or later, probably later than sooner, and then I'm going to read For Whom the Bell Tolls and, of course, The Old Man and the Sea. I need to push through because his reputation alone deserves that. And who knows, I might like his other works. Next are the 5 books I've got left to read by Haruki Murakami. These will definitely stay on my TBR. Then finally I want to mention the 4 books on the far right, starting with the red one. They are 4 different versions of the Tao Te Ching. These are very condensed philosophical writings written in the 6th century BC in China. I'm very eager to read the source material of the Tao, because the Tao to me contains the most profound wisdom of being a human, really. From the books on this second shelf, I only would like to highlight the Neale Donald Walsch books. These conversations with God are so intriguing and so good, and I've got 5 left of them. Also the books by Don Miguel Ruiz and his son, they're amazingly good, so they will definitely stay on my TBR. On the left here you see the books I've got left to read by Oliver Sacks, including his own biography. I read quite some books by this neurologist, like Musicophilia, Hallucinations, or The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And then I read Migraine, which is a very tough and scholarly book. Because of this book, I hesitated to pick up a next one by Oliver Sacks, but all the books you can see here in this picture really hold very, very high promise for me. With the exception of the 3 books on the left there, this whole shelf is occupied by Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher. I have read some of his works a long time ago, and I was impressed greatly by his writing skills and of course what he was writing about. These books you see here are with me for a long time already, and they are part of a reading dream, if you will. But quite recently I bought the biography that's on the far right there, I Am Dynamite, and I have this new plan. While I'm reading this biography, I will pick up every book Nietzsche wrote that is mentioned in the biography. So in that way, I'll be reading his entire oeuvre. It's a reading dream, but some dreams come true. The 2 names of this shelf I would like to mention are Ayn Rand and Edgar Cayce. Ayn Rand is a name that keeps popping up in all kinds of literature. I still haven't read anything by her, but she is such an important writer in the history of America. And Edgar Cayce is someone I'll always be interested in. So these are the last books I have left that were written by him or about him, and they will definitely remain on my TBR. From this next shelf, I will mention the biography about Erasmus. He is a Dutch humanist thinker. I read a few books by him and he has always intrigued me. Then there are 2 books I've left written by Irvin Yalom. I read his novel Nietzsche Wept, which I liked. I wasn't very enthusiastic about it, but it was well written, and I'm still curious about the other 2 books. From this shelf, just a handful of books will remain on my TBR. For now, I will only mention the biography about William Faulkner. Then the final shelf of the literature section, which is really less than half a shelf, is all the books I have by Kurt Vonnegut. I've only read 2 of his books so far, Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast for Champions. Slaughterhouse-Five made a lasting impression on me, and Breakfast for Champions evoked some mixed feelings. On the one hand, I found it very good, and on the other, very confusing. I'm still curious about the other books by Kurt Vonnegut, so these will definitely remain on my TBR. This drastic elimination process of my TBR for literature has resulted in 3 shelves full of books that will no longer attract any attention of me any longer. Further on, I will highlight a few of the books that are eliminated from this TBR, but first I want to ask you, do you see in these 3 shelves any title of which you say you really should put that book back on your TBR? I'd be very happy to welcome any suggestion. In case you hadn't noticed already, this elimination process has been arduous for me. It was very hard for me to say goodbye to many of those books. A few of those I would still like to highlight. This is a goodbye to very good friends. 60 of them, in fact. Of course I won't be mentioning all of them, just a few. I will restrain myself from telling a story about each of these books you see in this picture. I'll only mention the 6 books on the left. These 6 are related to one of my interests, which is the Great Blasket. That is an island that lies west of Ireland. Any of you who have seen one of my previous videos knows what I'm talking about. Let's just leave it at that. Let me first mention Spinoza. I tried reading his main work, The Ethica. I think I started about 4 times and stranded really early on. So I have to admit to myself that this is a bit too high reached for me. I'll be eliminating 3 books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. I've read 2 of his books, The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness. Like many other books I've been reading in the past, these books by Taleb are mainly business related. Although I liked those books, they were very good, but I just won't be reading them anymore. I've got 2 books by Ian McEwan, they're separated here. I like Ian McEwan. I read lots of his works when I was younger, but then I read his novel Atonement, which didn't agree with me very well. And after that, I never had the inclination to turn back to his novel. Also, the book by José Saramago, which is a Dutch translation, of course. I read all of his works. This novel was rediscovered after his death, and it's one of his earlier works. I read another of his earlier works and didn't like it, so this is going to go as well. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.